Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture on Chapter 5 entitled The Integumentary System. Now, when many people hear the integumentary system, they automatically think about their skin, which is 100% correct. The skin is, after all, the largest organ that we have as humans. But the integumentary system also covers what we like to call the accessories that come with the skin, which are going to be things like your hair, your nails, as well as different glands, including sweat glands and sebaceous glands. Now, in part one, we're going to focus on our skin. We're going to take a look at what it's composed of, what type of layers, what type of cells you can find in it, as well as some of the functions of the skin. And then in our second part, we're going to focus on the accessory. So we'll talk about what determines your hair color, your hair texture. We're also going to talk about how the integumentary system is instrumental in nail formation. And of course, we have to talk about the different glands that are embedded within the skin and their secretions. Now, taking a look at the skin, what we see is that we have two distinctive regions that make up our skin. The top layer shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, and that is called the epidermis, and it is filled with stratified squamous epithelium. This is the most superficial region, and as you may recall, one of the characteristics of epithelium tissue is the fact that it is avascular. So that means that there are no blood vessels running through this particular section. Instead, the cells will rely on the connective tissue layer that is underneath, composed of what we call the dermis, to provide the nutrients and get rid of the waste products that are being accumulated in the epidermis. So the epidermis is the top layer. It's made of epithelium tissue, lots and lots and lots of stratified squamous epithelium just stacked on top of each other. And the second layer is going to be the dermis layer. The dermis layer is composed of two different regions. And in a little bit, we'll talk about the fact that we'll see lots of areolar tissue as well as dense, irregular connective tissue embedded within this section. And the dermis layer will have many different functions. One of the primary one, of course, will be for it to be supplying nutrients and access to blood vessels to the epidermis, but it will also allow for the anchoring of the epidermis so that it can provide more stability to the overall skin. There's also a third section of skin called the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis is not officially part of the skin, but it is very closely embedded with the dermis, and we see that it will often allow for more of a shock and insulation type function to apply to it. So oftentimes it's mentioned whenever you talk about the epidermis and the dermis, but please keep in mind that it's not officially part of the skin. The hypodermis is mostly filled with adipose tissue, and it does allow anchoring onto the muscles primarily that are found underneath it. Here is a beautiful illustration of a little cube of skin, and you can see on top the section that is labeled as the epidermis, and upon closer inspection you can see the stratified squamous cells stacked ever so neatly on top of each other. And then the dermis you can see is significantly thicker, and on this illustration they went ahead and they highlighted the fact that you have the papillary layer and you have the reticular layer that make up the dermis, and we'll talk more about those towards the end of our part 1 discussion. And last but not least, here by these yellow structures, those are adipose tissues, we have our hypodermis. Now, please keep in mind, it's not considered part of the skin, even though it is very closely embedded. And as you can see from the cube, in addition to the cells, we also have lots of accessory organs. So you can see the hairs that are sticking out. We can see the different pores that have been embedded and secretions, and we'll talk all about these different accessory organs, including some of the nerve fibers that are embedded within the skin as we move along through the chapter. Now, let's start on top with the epidermis, and let's take a look at what type of cells you would find there. And it turns that there are 4 main cell types to be found in our epidermis. And our epidermis is going to be stratified squamous epithelium, as I mentioned to you before. And for the skin, it's going to be completely correct, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now, what does keratinized mean again? that means that it has a layer of dead cells on top. Yes, those of you who joined us for our discussion for epithelium tissue in our previous chapter, remember that keratinized means you have several layers of dead cells that sit on top of the stratified squamous structure. Now back to the cells. So there are four main cells. The first one are going to be our skin cells. Those are the keratinocytes. The keratinocytes get their name because they are going to be able to produce lots and lots of keratin. Now, keratin is a protein-based structure that is going to be utilized to create a waterproof layer within the skin, and that's going to help us to create a barrier that separates external and internal environments. These keratinocytes are the majority cell type in our epidermis. That's why people will casually call them your skin cells, but they are specific in the fact that they're able to produce keratin, so scientifically they're referred to as keratinocytes. They will often utilize anchoring or desmosome cell junctions, which means that they are connected, but they have a flexibility aspect to them that allows them to stretch and return back to their original position without being torn apart. In the keratinocytes, and we'll talk more about this when we take a look at the layers of the epidermis, we have specific stem cells that are continuously producing new keratinocytes for us for the remainder of our lives. Those are located in what we like to call the stratum basalis, or the basement membrane, the lowest layer of the epidermis of the skin. So keratinocytes are an example of a cell type that are continuously produced by the body because it is based on a stem cell production. So it's sort of like having an unlimited amount of skin cells at your exposure for the life. Here is an illustration of the cells of the epidermis. I want to point a few things out, which is, and I'm going to bracket it right here. This particular section, this is going to be all epidermis because you can see the squamous cells. You can see how they're stacked on top of each other, making it stratified. This section right here is going to be our dermis layer as marked, and that is going to be filled with connective tissues. As you can see, you don't have the cell-to-cell contact. Instead, you start seeing more fibers as well as little nuclei peeking up here and there. Now, looking at our epidermis, we're going to notice that we have labels for our keratinocytes. So here you see on top, it says exfoliating and dead keratinocytes because that is going to be the keratinized section of the stratified squamous. And then anything below it, you can see they've been labeled as living keratinocytes. So all these pink with purple little nuclei in the middle, those are keratinocytes. And here at the bottom, the first layer of the epidermis, notice how they labeled a stem cell. You can see it's doing its mitotic division. It looks like it's in the middle of metaphase. Here is another one. And these are found in the stratum basalis, which is the bottom layer of the epidermis. More detail on that to follow. And they will give continuous rise to new keratinocytes as we go about our day-to-day activity. Now, the keratinocytes, as they're formed at the bottom, will start migrating upwards. And as they migrate upward, you're going to notice that they have some morphological changes, but they're also going to start generating their keratin and forming that waterproof layer. So once we get to know the different cell types, we'll talk about the different layers or stratums of the epidermis and how each of them differs from the one that's below it or above it. All right, so all the pink and purple are keratinocytes, are skin cells. Now let's take a look what this one's all about. This one that has more of a brown pigment with the little dots all over. Those are going to be called melanocytes. Melanocytes get their name because they're able to melanin, which is a pigment, and these are going to be packed in melanosomes, which are little vesicles. And what's going to happen is whenever our body is exposed to the sun, or I should say the UV of the sun, our keratinocytes will need some protection. And that protection will come in the form of melanin. So the melanocytes will secrete the melanin and will then pass it on to the keratinocytes, which will then absorb it and put it on display, almost like creating a sunscreen layer. This is what we see whenever a person gets a tan. It basically means that they have high levels of melanin that are being produced. So when you rock around in the sun excessively, your body will secrete melanin, and we correspond that to, oh, we had a really nice day out in the sun, we got a beautiful tan, but it's really the keratinocytes' way of protecting themselves from the UV rays. The other type of cells that you will have in your epidermis are going to be your dendritic cells, also called your Langerhans cells. These are going to play a role in your immune system, and that's because the dendritic cells are specialized macrophages that basically peer through the epidermis looking for any type of infection, like maybe a bacterial infection, or maybe you have some debris that came in because you had a little blister or whatnot that comes into play. The Langerhans cell or dendritic cell will detect it, clear it up, and if needed, will alert the immune system. I didn't mean to say blister. I meant to say splinter in your finger. My apologies. The fourth type is going to be for sensory, and that is called the Merkel cell, although your book likes to call it the tactile cell. And they will be in connection with the nervous system so that there are sensory receptors that will allow you to detect any type of movement or texture utilizing contact with the epidermis. So for instance, the sensation of feeling a little ant walking on your skin, or feeling a raindrop fall on your skin, or even when we look at Braille, people who are used to reading Braille, they are detecting the bumps and the texture changes, and they're able to interpret that thanks to the Merkel cells. Here is a look at our picture we were referencing before, and we identified the keratinocytes. So now we can also highlight the melanocytes once again. There you go. And then here in green, notice how it's like a star-shaped one? That is our dendritic Langerhans cell. And then here we have our Merkel tactile cell. And notice how it comes into contact here with the yellow, which is a nerve fiber, which makes sense because we were talking about the fact that it helps us with sensory detection. All right, so those are the 4 cells we would find in our epidermis. We have our keratinocytes, the skin cells that are filled with keratin. We have our melanocytes that are going to help us secrete melanin, which the keratinocytes will take up and use as protection for the UV rays of the sun. We have dendritic cells, also called Langerhans cells, which are part of the immune system, macrophages that are looking for any abnormalities or debris. And then in blue, we have our little nerve cells, our little Merkel tactile cells. Now that we are more familiar with the cells, let's take a look at the layers that make up the epidermis. And these layers are going to be referred to as stratums. And we see that you either have 4 or 5 layers or stratums, depending on if you're looking at thick or thin skin. The majority of your body is classified as thin skin, but you do have some areas that are thick skin. These are going to be areas that are usually exposed to high levels of abrasion. So your fingertips, the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, those are all examples of thick skin. The rest of the skin, so like the skin that covers your belly, your thighs, your arms, that's all classified as thin skin. Structurally, thick skin will have an extra layer. It's called the stratum lucidum. And then thin skin will have only 4 layers. So as you can see at the bottom of the PowerPoint, it says there are 5 layers of the skin. The stratum basal, this is starting from the bottom, is the first one to be encountered, followed by the stratum spinosum and the stratum granulosum. And then the stratum lucidum is only seen at thick skin, so fingertips, palms, soles of the feet. And the stratum corneum will be the most superficial, or the top layer that we're looking at. I once came along the saying that someone shared with me. They said, think of the sentence, come, let's get sunburned. And I thought it was a little awkward sentence to share, so it might be memorable. But if you think of that sentence, then the first letter of each word can help you memorize the stratum names, but keep in mind that it will help you memorize it from superficial to deep. So you're going to go from top to bottom, starting with the corneum, lucidium, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. Keeping in mind that the lucidium is only found in thick skin. Thin skin will just have the 1, 2, 3, and 5, or basal, spinosum, granulosum, and corneum. Let's take a look at what it looks like under an illustration. Here we go, our ever familiar picture. Now we're focusing on the left, and we can see the stratum corneum on top. Notice how with the stratum corneum, you don't really see any specific cells or nuclei, and that is because that is nothing but dead cells. That is what makes up the keratinized section of the epidermis. Stratum lucidium, remember that one's only found under thick skin, gets its name because it's literally a layer of clear, transparent cells. And then the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, which is the largest layer, and finally leading us to the deepest layer, which is the stratum basal. That is where you're going to have your basement membrane, or your connection point between the epidermis and the dermis section of the skin below. All right, let's take a few minutes out. Let's take a look at our individual stratums, and we'll talk about what it does, what type of cells will you find there, and of course, is it a large or a smaller type layer that it brings. All right, so stratum basal, as I was mentioning before, this is going to be the deepest layer. And on this deepest layer, not only are we going to find our basement membrane and our attachment point to the dermis, but we're also going to be finding our original stem cells within this. The stratum basal is a single row of cells, it's just one row, and the stem cells, keep in mind, will provide us with a continuous supply of keratinocytes. Normally what we see is that to get from the bottom to the top, so from the stratum basal to the stratum corneum, it should take about 25 to 45 days for, they're calling it the daughter cells, which are the new cells that are being produced, the keratinocytes, to travel from bottom to top of the cell. And along the way, as it's traveling, the cells will have some morphological changes. They will start developing keratin, and eventually the cells will die and become part of that keratinized layer before they are slouched off into the universe. So when you, for instance, see dust particles or even dandruff, another example, those are all examples of slouched off keratinocytes that have been flaked off the body. On this layer, you will also find some melanocytes. Remember, those are the ones that are going to be producing our melanin. But the take-home message is that the stratum basalis will be one single layer of cells, and it's best known for the fact that it will house the stem cells that will give rise to the keratinocytes, and you will also find some melanocytes in this particular layer. So that is the stratum basalis. Next, we're going to go to the stratum spinosum, and the stratum spinosum is named because of the morphological change that we see happening within our keratinocytes. So as the keratinocytes leave the basal layer and they start moving upwards, we see that in the stratum spinosum, they'll have several layers of cells to work through, that they'll start making interlocking filament attachments through their anchoring or desmosome junction. And as they're creating these filaments, it allows for a little bit of flexibility and tension to occur within the skin cells. And we also start to see that because of this, the cells will go from more of a circular to more of a spiky, like almost a star-shaped appearance. And that is then why they get their name of being a prickly layer, or the stratum spinosum. So it hints at the fact that the keratinocytes appear to be more spiky underneath the microscope. We're also going to see that there's going to be a production of the keratin filaments that starts to increase. And as the filaments start to accumulate, it will start flattening the overall appearance of the cell. Within the stratum spinosum, you will also find that there will be plenty of melanocytes as well as dendritic cells that can be housed there. Let's go back to our picture. So now we're in the stratum spinosum. Notice how you have several layers. This is actually the largest layer within, and we can see that we have plenty of keratinocytes. Now notice how now the cells are not as small as they were previously. Now they're more elongated and they have more of a spiky edge around many of their sides. So that's the spinosum. And then if you look, you're going to notice that the cells are connected by these small little lines. Those are meant to indicate that you have your anchoring or your desmosome junctions that are allowing them to kind of create that little pull and tug quality of the skin. And you can also see that we have our dendritic cell housed right in the middle, warming its way around looking for anything that doesn't belong. Now, from the stratum spinosum, we're going to go to the stratum granulosum. And even by looking at our illustration, we can notice that in the cytoplasm, we're going to go from a pink to more of a purple format with all these little granules floating around. So let's see what the stratum granulosum brings to the party. The stratum granulosum, or the granular layer, is about 4 to 6 cells thick. These cells are flat because of the amount of keratin filament that they're filled with. And what we see happening is that now the cells will continue to flatten and their nuclei and organelles start to disintegrate. They start to disappear. And keratinization begins. And keratinization basically means that we're now going to start collecting keratinohyaline granules, and these are going to allow for lamellar granules to be secreted, and this will allow for a water-resistant glycolipid to form that forms a waterproof barrier. So let me try to say that again because I felt like I just threw a lot in within a small period of time. In stratum granulosum, we see that the keratinocytes, which were already spiky in appearance, will continue to flatten. And part of the flattening will be assisted by the fact that their nucleus and their organelles are starting to disappear. They're disintegrating. We're getting rid of them. We also see that with the help of the keratin filaments, we're going to have granules that will help accumulate the keratin fibers, and the cells will start accumulating or producing a glycolipid secretion that creates a waterproof barrier. So when you look at it under the microscope, the reason that you call it the granulosum or granular layer is because the inside of the cell, the cytoplasmic content, is filled with little granules. It is filled with little fibers. It is filled with pieces of the nuclei and the organelles that are disintegrating and that are being lost within the cell. And the cell continues to flatten. And the whole purpose of the stratum granulosum is that the formation of the waterproof layer is added at this particular stratum. Now, the waterproof layer is meant to protect us. It's meant to make it harder for any type of pathogen or insect or virus or whatnot to protrude through the cell walls and gain access to our internal through the epidermis. So it's meant as a protective layer. But because you form this waterproof layer, you also cut off nutrients from any cell that is above the waterproof layer. So what we see happening is as the keratinocytes migrate upwards, as they get towards the edge of the stratum granulosum and they're trying to get to the higher stratum, they're going to start dying off because they no longer have access to the nutrients complementary of the capillaries provided by the dermis layer. And if you look at our illustration, you can see that the stratum granulosum, if you go right above it in the stratum lucidium, which is only found in thick skin, and the stratum corneum, those cells are all dead. These are all keratinized cells. And part of that is because the waterproof barrier that the stratum granulosum secretes doesn't allow for the nutrients to migrate any higher. So therefore, the cells are cut off from the nutrients and they start to die off. They flatten even more and they form that keratinized layer. Stratum lucidium and stratum corneum, those are the top two layers. Please keep in mind, and I know I said it a bunch of times, Stratum lucidium is only found in thick skin. It's all about adding additional layers for these high abrasion areas. And like I said, these are going to be areas like your fingertips, your palms of your hand, and the soles of your feet. The stratum corneum, this is going to be 20 to 30 rows of flat anucleated keratinized dead cells. Now, technically, the stratum corneum has more rows than the stratum spinosum. I know, but the stratum spinosum is composed of living cells. So that's why I was saying that it has the highest stratum. I guess I should have been a little bit more specific and said that the stratum spinosum is the largest stratum or layer of living cells. But overall, the stratum corneum will have the most stratified or rows of cells, but these are dead cells. So it's also very flattened cells. So that's why it kind of gives the appearance of not 20 to 30 living cells under the microscope. Now, please keep in mind that even though the cells are dead, they are meant there as a protective layer because it creates a very dry environment so that bacteria and yeast do not find it to be very habitable and they stay away from our skin, giving us a nice first line of defense from any type of pathogen that is trying to enter into our system. Here is another illustration of our stratum. So you could see for the epidermis, we see our epithelium cell. On the left is under the microscope, and then on the right is kind of like an illustrated example of it. So we could see the dermis peaking at the bottom, and then we can see the stratum basalis, which is our bottom, our one layer of cells that where we find our mitotically active cells, aka our stem cells. We also find our melanocytes in there. Stratum spinosum gets its name because of the overall lengthening, or I should say stretching, spiny appearance of the keratinocytes. Stratum granulosum, it's going to see the cells more flattening, the nucleus and the organelle starting to disintegrate, and the formation of the waterproof layer. And last but not least, we're going to have our stratum corneum. So this picture is obviously that of thin skin, haha, because notice how they don't have the stratum lucidium. Stratum corneum will then be the most superficial, the top layer, which will have nothing but dead keratinocytes. And this is then if someone gets an exfoliation, or I think we've talked about this in class before, when you go to get yourself a pedicure and they start scraping the bottom of your feet and you see these little cells falling off, these little flakes falling off. Those are the keratinized or dead cells from the stratum corneum. Alrighty. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening underneath the epidermis, and that would be the dermis layer. The dermis layer is filled with connective tissue, and because we have connective tissue, keep in mind, this means that we're going to have different cells. So in our case, we're going to take a look at the fibroblast cells. There are some more immune cells in the form of macrophages. You can also find the occasional mast cell, which helps us with histamine production, as well as other leukocytes or white blood cells. The connective tissue is very vascular, so we're going to have lots and lots of blood vessels, as well as nerves and lymphatic vessels. And overall, the dermis is separated into two layers. We have the papillary layer, and we have the reticular layer. And if you think about it, since the epidermis is avascular and the dermis is full of blood vessels, that means that if you cut your skin and you start bleeding, that you have cut through the epidermis and the dermis. If you scrape your skin and it only gets that little white line, but there is no blood coming, that means that you've only done damage to the epidermis. Alrighty, so do me a favor, take a look at your fingertips. And when you look at your fingertips, you should see small little ridges that make up our fingerprint. The ridges that you see is actually the reticular, or the papillary layer of the dermis peeking through your epidermis. And that papillary layer is full of areolar connective tissue and has lots and lots of collagen, elastic fibers, and definitely blood vessels. In fact, on the slide that we're looking at, we see that you have this thing called dermal papilla, which is the dermis that is peeking through the epidermis, allowing for the fingerprint formation or loops to form. If you ever get a blister is an accumulation of liquid that sits between the epidermis and the dermis. Oftentimes, if you have a little bit of an infection or some abrasion, you can have some debris that will accumulate, and a blister will form, allowing the fluid to accumulate as the immune cells were cleaning up that area. And then oftentimes we'll go and we'll kind of pop it, and then it will deplete itself. And that will then just show you the connection point between the epidermis, the top layer of the skin, and the dermis, the bottom layer of the skin. I believe there was oh, here we go. So here we have a close-up of the friction ridges that are created by the peaking of the reticular, the papillary layer. I keep calling it the reticular, the papillary layer of the dermis. And embedded within, you're also going to be seeing some sensory cells, as well as the fact that you have your sweat pores that are in there. So you can find them. And if you look ever closely, you see the small little openings within the ridges that are peeking out. Okay, so now we can finally refer to the reticular layer. The reticular layer lies underneath the papillary layer, and it's actually 80% of the thermal thickness, so it's the majority of it. Now, instead of areolar tissue, in the reticular layer, we're going to have dense, irregular tissue. And as you may recall, that means that it's going to have lots and lots of collagen fibers embedded within. It also has some elastic fibers, which help with the stretching and the recoil, especially as movement occurs within the skin. But the collagen fibers are really the ones that do the majority of the work in the reticular layer because they will provide strength and resilience. So if there's any pressure or abrasion placed on the skin, it's able to absorb it without causing maximum damage. It's also helped in a way for us to hydrate our skin because it allows for the water to bind. This, of course, is really important because later on we're going to be looking to forming that waterproof barrier that will be utilized to create that keratinized layer. Within the reticular layer, you will also find pockets of little adipose cells, lots of blood vessels that will be an anchoring point between our reticular layer and the hypodermis, that little adipose tissue layer that's below it. Remember that the hypodermis, even though it's mentioned often, is not part of the skin. The skin is simply the epidermis and the dermis. Here's a little interesting statement to think about. Stretch marks. Stretch marks are actually caused by tearing of collagen fibers whenever there is an abrupt change to the surface area or volume of the dermal layer. So for instance, if someone has gained weight, or we often see it in women who become pregnant during the last few weeks when the belly really expands as the baby is growing, we do see that the dermis has to expand rather quickly, and that can cause some collagen fibers to tear, and that is then seen through the epidermis as stretch marks. The other thing that I want to mention to you is that we can take a look at the natural orientation of the collagen fiber in the dermis, and we are able then to create what we call cleavage or tension lines. And we could see it on our subject right here, the little red lines that protrude all throughout the body. These are actually great markers to see how the skin and the muscle fibers are running in a parallel format. So oftentimes surgeons will rely on these tension lines to make incisions that will cause patients to heal at a quicker rate because they're cutting along the muscle fibers in a parallel format versus inversely doing more damage, causing for obviously a longer recuperation time. We also have what we call flexure lines. Flexure lines are when the reticular layers are close to dermal folds or joints. So if you take your finger and you kind of scrunch them up, this is then when we see our little flexure lines. It just basically allows for the dermal layer to create creases within the skin. And that, of course, all has to do with the joint movement. So, in case you were wondering why I have these darkened lines there, these are called flexure lines because of the interaction of the reticular layer with the nearby joints. The last thing I want to discuss for our first part of our lecture for chapter 5 is skin color. So there are three main pigments that naturally contribute to skin color. Melanin is by far the primary one, and that, as we mentioned before, is because melanocytes in our skin, in our epidermis, will be able to secrete melanin. And the point of melanin is that it will allow us to be shielded from the UV layers of the sun. So the more sun exposure you have, the higher levels of melanin production will occur. And this is then what we correspond with someone getting a tan. Now, there are different versions of melanin. You have more of a yellowish, reddish one, which is called pheomelanin. And then you have eumelanin, which is more of a brownish black color. And from a genetic standpoint, it will depend on which allele or version of melanin and the amount you have that will overall determine your final skin tone. Now, here's an interesting fact to think about. Most people have the same number of keratinocytes and melanocytes. What differs is how much melanin they're able to produce and how the keratinocytes are able to absorb and put it on display. Let me give you an example. So here is a installation, or I should say histology slide, where we're taking a look at someone with dark skin versus light skin. And when we look at the dark skin versus the light skin, the first thing that we should see is that when we take a look at the epidermis is able to contain a more brighter or darker stained. Whereas with the light skinned individual, it's more faded in its appearance. And the reason for that is even though they have the same keratinocytes and melanocytes, someone who is dark skinned will produce higher levels of melanin, and the melanin that's produced is more likely to be taken up by the keratinocytes, the skin cells, and the melanin is then displayed over the entirety of the keratinocytes, allowing for that beautiful pigment to shine through. Someone who is fair or light skinned, what we see happening is that they produce less melanin. And as they produce less melanin, their keratinocytes, their skin cells, are less likely to absorb it. And when they absorb it, they only tend to display it in clusters, so only in small areas of the cell instead of the entire surface area, allowing for a lighter color to show through. This will then also explain to you why some people get a tan and some people will burn when they are exposed to high levels of sun. And that is because if your body does naturally not produce enough melanin and your keratinocytes are not willing to soak it up and put it on display, your keratinocytes have no protection and in response will burn or get inflamed or red. And that is then the redness that we see when someone says, "Oh, I got a sunburn." So skin color, its primary pigment is melanin, and individuals who are genetically on the darker skin tone, that indicates the fact that their keratinocytes are more willing to take up the melanin and put it on full display, showcasing that beautiful coloring, while the light-skinned individuals, less melanin, less likely to take up the pigment, which means that they have a lighter or fairer skin tone. Now, melanin is not the only one that determines the overall skin tone. There are some other factors, but it's the majority one, the main one. Some other ones that play a role are keratin, and if the name makes you think of carrot, you're on the right spot. Keratin is a yellowish to orange pigment. We usually get that mostly seen in the palms and the soles of the feet. Um, Keratin can be used to be converted into vitamin A, which research has shown plays an important role in our vision and epidermal health. And then the third one is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin comes obviously from the transport of our red blood cells, and as blood streams close to the epidermis, it will allow for more of a pinkish hue to show. We primarily see this more in light-skinned individuals just because it's able to peek through the keratinocytes, and it's more on the transparent side, so you're able to see the blood vessels. but most of us will have a few veins that lie very close to the surface. So we'll see the bluing of the vein, and that's because that blood, of course, is deoxygenated. And that's just another example of a pigment showing through the epidermis layer. All right, I'm going to stop here, and I hope you'll join me for the second part of the chapter. And in the meanwhile, if there's any comments, questions, or concern, please feel free to email me. All right, we'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.